For 20 years, my son, David, had completely shut me out of his life. He didn't speak to me and ignored every single attempt I made to get in touch. That all changed once I became wealthy. Suddenly, he invited me to Christmas as though nothing had happened, but I had a plan. When I arrived at his house, I knew that behind their smiles, their faces were lit up with a greedy hunger for my money. But when they finally saw what I had prepared for them, their faces turned ashen and their grins vanished. The phone rang just as I was settling into my evening routine. Its shrill sound cut through the December silence of my Lincoln home like a blade. I almost didn't answer, since telemarketers seem to have a knack for calling right at dinner time. But for some reason, I reached for the receiver. The voice that called out, "Dad," hit me with the force of a physical blow. 20 years. 20 years of silence. And now this casual greeting, as if we had spoken just yesterday. I replied with his name, keeping my own voice steady even though my knuckles were turning white around the phone. I told him this was certainly unexpected. I could hear his familiar, nervous laugh, the one he had used as a child whenever he was caught in a lie. He admitted that it had been a while and explained that Christmas was approaching. He said that Melanie and he had been talking and that they would love for me to come over for dinner to spend some family time together. The phrase, family time, tasted bitter in my mouth. I glanced at the faded family photo on my kitchen table, the one where a gap-toothed, smiling David was 8, before everything fell apart. I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. I asked how he could consider this a while. I pointed out that he had not returned any of my calls in 2 decades. I reminded him about the birthday cards and graduation invitation I had mailed, all of which had been returned unopened. He began to say that he had been busy with his career and starting a family, adding that there was never enough time. I stood up, pacing the small kitchen. Outside, Christmas lights twinkled mockingly in my neighbor's windows. I thought about how there was never enough time for me, but suddenly, there was time now, right after the news about my lottery win hit the papers. I paused, and the silence stretched for too long. He claimed he didn't know what I was talking about. I kept my voice deliberately calm, saying that I had won $15 million and that the story had been on the front page of the Lincoln Journal-Star just last month. I noted that it was quite a coincidence, this sudden invitation. He insisted that he was happy for me and that wasn't why he was calling. He said they just thought it would be nice to reconnect since we were both getting older. I almost laughed at that. I had been getting older for 20 years. I asked David where he was when I had heart surgery, and when I spent Christmas alone in this empty house, year after year. His voice became defensive, saying that he knew things had not been perfect between us but that it was all in the past, and that family had to count for something. The word family hung between us like a curse. I thought of all the times I had sat by this same phone, hoping it would ring. All the unanswered messages, the returned letters, the birthdays spent in silence. I finally said he was right and that family did count for something. I told him I would be there. He seemed genuinely surprised, saying that was great and that he would text me the address for Christmas Eve around 6 o'clock. I told him to do that, and then paused, letting the silence stretch. I added that I had a surprise for him. His voice brightened, and I could practically hear the dollar signs in his tone as he asked what kind of surprise it was. I simply said that he would see and then hung up before he could respond. I set the phone down carefully, my hands trembling just slightly. The kitchen felt different now, charged with possibility. Outside, the snow had just begun to fall, dusting the quiet streets of Lincoln with white. I stood there for a long moment, staring into space, my mind drifting back to the last time I had seen my son's face. It had been so long ago, but some wounds never truly heal, they just wait, buried under years of resignation and quiet dignity, until the right moment comes to reveal themselves. I walked to the window, watching the snowfall, and remembered how it all began. The snow brought me back to that December, 2 decades ago, when everything I had built came crashing down. I had been sitting in this same kitchen, though the house had felt different then, warmer, filled with the promise of family. Melanie had been packing, her suitcases spread across our bedroom floor like open wounds. Her voice echoed in my memory, sharp and cruel. She thought I was pathetic. She wondered what I had to show for myself at 45 years old. She mentioned my dead-end job at Morrison & Associates, a mortgage we could barely afford, and dreams that would never come true. I remembered standing in the doorway, watching her meticulously fold clothes. I had thought we were happy. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and asked when I had last surprised her or taken her somewhere nice. She said that Bob, her new boyfriend, treated her like a queen. Bob, with his BMW and corner office, had been calling our house for months before I finally understood what was happening. I asked her about David, grasping at straws. I told her he needed stability and a father. She said he needed a winner for a father and then slammed the suitcase shut, saying that all I had ever been was a disappointment. The divorce had been swift and brutal. Melanie's lawyer was expensive while mine was overworked and underpaid. She walked away with the house, the car, and our son's loyalty. I moved into this small rental in Lincoln, starting over at 45 with nothing but my accounting job and the bitter taste of betrayal. David was 18 then, old enough to choose sides. He chose hers without hesitation. In one of our last conversations, his voice was cold with teenage certainty. He said his mother was right. He said that I was just making excuses and that maybe if I had tried harder and been more successful, none of this would have happened. I tried to explain and make him understand, but he had already made up his mind. His stepfather had money, influence, and connections. What did I have? A small apartment and a broken heart. 20 years of silence followed. 20 years of returned birthday cards, phone calls that went straight to voicemail, and Christmas mornings spent alone in this quiet house. I learned to live with the emptiness, to find meaning in small things like my work, my books, and the occasional kindness of neighbors. But I never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday my son would remember the man who taught him how to ride a bike, who stayed up all night when he had pneumonia, and who loved him unconditionally, even when love wasn't enough. The lottery win had changed everything. I won $15 million tax-free from a ticket I had bought on a whim at Casey's General Store. The story had made the local news and then the state papers. Within a week, my phone had started ringing again. Old friends I had not heard from in years and distant relatives I had forgotten existed. And then today, the call I had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder I had been assembling for months. It contained bank statements, investment records, and legal documents, everything I would need for Christmas Eve. It was everything I would need to show my son exactly what kind of man his father had become. The snow continued to fall outside, covering Lincoln in pristine white. Soon, very soon, I would have my chance to give David and Melanie the surprise they had been waiting for. But something told me it would not be quite what they expected. I smiled to myself as I closed the folder. 20 years was a long time to wait for justice, but some things, I had learned, were worth the wait. The isolation had been my teacher, though I hadn't realized it at the time. After the divorce, when the loneliness settled into my bones like Lincoln's winter cold, I needed something to fill the endless hours. That's when I discovered my gift for numbers. Not just the accounting kind, but the kind that could build empires from dust. It started with a foreclosure notice I had seen in the Lincoln Journal-Star back in 2008. It was a small duplex on the south side. Nothing special, but the price caught my eye. While everyone else was running scared from the housing market, I saw an opportunity. I drove past the property on my lunch break, noting the solid bones beneath the peeling paint and overgrown yard. That night, I spread newspaper clippings across my kitchen table, their yellowed edges curling in the lamplight. I devoured all the information about mortgage rates, property values, and market predictions like a starving man. The old wooden chair creaked under my weight as I leaned forward, calculating risks on the back of utility bills. I was asked by the skeptical banker if I was sure about this, as real estate was a dangerous game. I told him that I was sure, and I signed the papers with steady hands, though my heart was pounding. It was every penny I had saved since the divorce, plus a small loan against my modest retirement account. The duplex became my evening project. I would drive there after work, tools rattling in my trunk, and spend hours scraping paint, fixing leaks, and replacing rotted boards. The physical labor felt good and purposeful. For the first time in years, I was creating something instead of just surviving. 6 months later, I had tenants, good people, a young couple starting out, grateful for clean walls and working plumbing. The rent covered my mortgage with a small profit left over. I reinvested immediately, buying another property, then another. The Great Recession was my golden opportunity. While others lost fortunes, I built mine quietly, one careful purchase at a time. I learned to read neighborhoods like books, to spot potential where others saw only problems. The midnight calculations became routine, spreadsheets glowing on my computer screen, tracking income and expenses with methodical precision. By 2015, I owned 12 properties across Lincoln. By 2023, I lived in the same small rental, drove the same reliable Honda, and wore the same modest clothes, but beneath the surface, I was accumulating power, the kind that came from smart decisions made in patient solitude. The lottery win had been luck, sure, but it landed on a foundation I had built through discipline and determination. The $15 million was added to what I had already earned through sweat and strategy. I was worth more than David could imagine, more than Melanie would ever believe possible. I glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. The snow had stopped falling, leaving Lincoln wrapped in pristine silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the quiet man they had dismissed as a failure had become something else entirely. I wondered if David knew the full extent of what I had accomplished. Did he understand that his father was not just lucky but smart? I doubted it. In his mind, I was still the broken man who had lost everything 20 years ago. But that man was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to turn loneliness into strength and failure into triumph. The house settled around me with familiar sounds. I had work to do and plans to finalize. Christmas Eve was approaching, and I intended to be ready. Morning came with fresh snow dusting the windows, and I was sipping coffee at my kitchen table when the phone rang again. The sound made me pause, my cup halfway to my lips. 2 calls in 2 days after 2 decades of silence. It was Melanie's voice. It hit me like a cold wind, still that same breathy tone she used when she wanted something, though age had roughened the edges. She began by saying that she hoped I did not mind her calling and that she had gotten my number from David. I set my coffee down carefully, saying that it was very thoughtful of her to reach out. She said that she knew things ended badly between us but that we had a son together and that had to count for something. She then explained that David was in real trouble and needed help. I heard rustling in the background and whispers. Then David's voice came through, faint but clear. He told her to ask for more and say it was urgent. I kept my voice neutral, although my grip tightened on the receiver as I asked what kind of trouble he was in. She explained that his business was in trouble, saying that the startup world was so volatile. She let the sentence hang, telling me that he had investors breathing down his neck and that if he didn't come up with the money soon. She said she hated to ask but wondered if I could help for old time's sake. More whispers. She was told to say it was for the grandkids' future. Melanie continued, her voice taking on that pleading quality I remembered from our marriage. She said that it was for the grandkids' future, and asked if I wanted them to suffer because of business problems. I watched the steam rise from my coffee cup, thinking of all the times I had fallen for this routine, the manufactured crisis, the emotional manipulation, the way she had always known exactly which buttons to push. I asked her how much they needed. She said that $200,000 would cover the immediate problems, but if I could stretch to $300,000. Another whisper suggested that $400,000 would be safer. I almost laughed. $400,000 was being asked for as casually as borrowing sugar from a neighbor. Melanie then told me that she knew I was angry about the past, but that this was bigger than our problems. She insisted it was about family and about doing what was right. I slowly repeated the words, "What's right," and asked her what was right about 20 years of silence, about returning birthday cards unopened, and about teaching our son to treat his father like a stranger. Her voice hardened. She said that was ancient history and that we were talking about now, about my son's future. I told her I would not give them a single cent. The words came out cleaner than I had expected, without anger or bitterness, just fact. She sounded genuinely shocked and asked if I was serious. She said that I had won millions of dollars and asked what a few $100,000 was to help my own son. I repeated that they would not be getting a single cent, not now, not ever. She tried to counter, telling me that I loved him, that I was his father, and how could I just abandon him when he needed me most. I thought of all the times I had needed them, all the reaching out that had been ignored. I told her that I learned from the best. She told me I was making a mistake and that I would regret this. I calmly responded that I didn't think I would. She hung up on me just like that. I set the phone down and watched the snow continue to fall outside my window. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but full of possibility. I had passed the test. 20 years ago, I would have written the check, desperate to buy back their affection. But the man I had become understood something the old me never had: respect could not be purchased, and love that came with a price tag wasn't love at all. I finished my coffee and began planning my next move. Christmas Eve was still days away, but I had a feeling my son and his mother were not done with their little scheme. That was fine. I had waited 20 years for this moment. I could wait a little longer to see exactly how far they would go. The phone sat silent on the table, and I found myself almost hoping it would ring again, because each call made my Christmas surprise a little sweeter, a little more justified. They thought they were dealing with the same broken man who had lost everything decades ago. They had no idea who they were really up against. Sleep evaded me that night, and by dawn, I knew what I had to do. The morning light cast long shadows across my kitchen floor as I sat with my coffee, staring at the phone. It was one more test, one final confirmation of what I already suspected. I picked up the receiver and dialed David's number, my fingers steady despite the weight of what I was about to do. I was surprised, perhaps even pleased, to hear my son answer the phone so quickly. He told me he hadn't expected to hear from me so soon. I mentioned that I had been thinking about what his mother had said yesterday regarding his problems. He sounded more guarded as he dismissed it, saying that Melanie probably made it sound worse than it was and that she worried too much. I leaned back in my chair, watching the winter wind rattle my windows. I told him the real reason I called was that I had some problems of my own. I let the words hang in the air and heard a change in his breathing as he asked if I meant financial problems. I explained that I was afraid I had made some terrible decisions with my lottery winnings and had gotten caught up in cryptocurrency trading. I mentioned Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all those digital currencies everyone was talking about. His tone wasn't sympathetic, it was calculating. He asked how bad it was. I told him it was pretty bad and that I had lost most of it in a market crash last week. I said that they had warned me about volatile investments, but I had thought I knew better. I paused, letting him absorb my lie. I said I might have enough left to cover Christmas dinner, but not much more. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of the phone line. I could almost hear his thoughts shifting, recalibrating. He finally spoke, his voice as cool as a Nebraska winter, saying that was really unfortunate and that these things happen. I waited, giving him a chance to offer comfort, support, or anything that might resemble a son's concern. Then, he cleared his throat and mentioned Christmas, saying that maybe it would be better if I didn't come this year. He told me that with everything I was dealing with, I probably needed to focus on getting my finances sorted out. There it was, the mask completely slipping away. I simply said that I understood. I kept my voice neutral, though inside I felt a cold satisfaction. So, the invitation was off the table. He said I understood, saying that Melanie had been planning a big meal, and they were kind of counting on, and that it was probably better this way since it was less stress for everyone. Less stress? I thought to myself. I nodded to myself and agreed that I wouldn't want to burden him with my presence. He told me not to be like that and that it was just practical. He said that when I got back on my feet, we would definitely get together. I smiled grimly. When I got back on my feet. He said he had to run since he had a conference call in 5 minutes but that we would talk soon. The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down and stared out at the snow-covered streets of Lincoln. 20 years of silence, and the moment they thought I was broke again, the silence returned. I had known it would happen, but having it confirmed so brutally still stung. Not because I was surprised, but because it crystallized everything I had suspected about their motives. Love with conditions wasn't love at all. It was a business transaction. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the cold glass. Outside, my neighbors were already starting their day, warming up cars and shoveling their driveways. They were normal people living normal lives, probably taking for granted the simple fact that their families loved them for who they were, not for what they had. The test was complete. The jury had delivered its verdict. Now it was time to plan the sentencing. With that clarity, I spent the afternoon digging into the lives my son and ex-wife had built while ignoring mine. If they wanted to play games, I needed to understand the rules. I started with my old Lincoln business network, contacts I had made during my real estate ventures. A few phone calls revealed interesting information about David's startup, or rather, its spectacular failure. The person I spoke with at the Chamber of Commerce laughed bitterly. He explained that my son had burned through investor money like it was confetti. He had promised revolutionary software, but delivered nothing but excuses and expensive lunches. I asked what had happened to the investors. He said they were not happy and that the word was that David owed close to $2 million between the venture capital firm and private backers. He also mentioned that some of them were getting lawyers involved. I made notes on a legal pad. My accountant's mind automatically organized the information. $2 million in debt. That explained the desperation. The internet provided the rest of the puzzle. David's LinkedIn showed a string of failed ventures, each one lasting just long enough to attract funding before collapsing. His Instagram painted a picture of a lavish lifestyle, expensive restaurants, luxury cars, designer clothes, all funded by other people's money. But it was Melanie's Facebook that truly disgusted me. Her profile showed a woman playing the victim with masterful precision. There were photos of herself looking worn and tired, coupled with posts about her brave battle against cancer. One post from last month said it was day 47 of chemo, and that the treatments were draining, but the donations kept her fighting. It added that every dollar helped with medical bills and experimental treatments her insurance wouldn't cover. I scrolled through months of similar posts, each one more manipulative than the last. She had collected thousands of dollars in donations from well-meaning strangers, all based on a lie. Because I knew Melanie was not sick, she was just greedy. A quick search of Lincoln Hospital records through a contact who worked in administration confirmed my suspicions. No cancer treatments, no chemotherapy, not even a suspicious mole removal. I cross-referenced her posts with David's spending patterns on social media. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Every major donation spike coincided with David posting about a new business opportunity or expensive purchase. They were working together, a mother and son team, bleeding money from strangers while ignoring the man who had actually earned his wealth through honest work. I compiled everything into a folder, using the same methodical approach I had used for my real estate investments. It contained bank records, social media screenshots, testimonials from burned investors, and a paper trail that painted a clear picture of systematic fraud and emotional manipulation. The irony was not lost on me. They had dismissed me as a failure, a man not worth their time or attention. But that same man had built a fortune through patience and strategy, while they had built nothing but debt and deception. I closed my laptop as evening fell over Lincoln, the screen's glow fading into darkness. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new pieces of the puzzle. But tonight, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. I was no longer the victim in this story. I was becoming the author. The phone rang again, probably another desperate attempt to squeeze money from their rich father. I let it ring, listening to the sound echo through my quiet house. I would let them wonder and worry. Christmas was still days away, and I had work to do. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Lincoln in white, clean, pure, ready for a fresh start. Dawn brought focus, and I reached for the phone before my morning coffee had finished brewing. The notes from yesterday's research lay spread across my kitchen table like a battle plan. It was time to see just how far my son's greed would take him. David answered on the second ring. He said he was surprised, since this was twice in 2 days. I told him I had good news. I mentioned the cryptocurrency investments I had told him about, the ones that had supposedly wiped me out. He sounded weary, as if he suspected where this was heading. I told him that I had managed to recover most of it. I said I was day trading and had bought the dip and rode it back up, and that it had turned out better than I had expected. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. I counted. He said that was fantastic and that he was so relieved and had been worried about me. The lie came so easily to him, without a hint of shame or embarrassment about how quickly he had dismissed me when he thought I was broke. So I continued, telling him that I was thinking maybe Christmas was back on if the invitation still stood. Of course, he said, it did. He said Melanie would be thrilled and had been looking forward to seeing me. Another lie. I could hear the calculations clicking behind his words like an old cash register. He then shifted his voice, making it more intimate and son-like. He said that speaking of Christmas, he knew it was awkward to bring up, but since I had mentioned my financial recovery, he was wondering if I might consider helping him with something. I smiled grimly. He said it was a business opportunity that was time-sensitive and the kind of deal that could set him up for life, but that he needed to move quickly. He said that $300,000 would cover his entry stake. It wasn't a loan request, it was a demand wrapped in opportunity. I told him that was a significant amount. He agreed but said this wasn't just about him. It was about securing the family's future, my grandchildren's future. He added that honestly, after everything that had happened between us, he thought this might be a way to start fresh. The manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. Family, grandchildren, fresh starts, all the buttons he thought would work on the man I used to be. I told him to tell me more about this opportunity, injecting just enough interest to keep him talking. He said it was in the tech sector, AI development, and that it was revolutionary stuff. He added that the initial investors were projecting returns of 500% within 18 months. The same pitch he had probably used on his previous victims. I wondered if he had even bothered to change the numbers. I told him that 500% sounded almost too good to be true. He said he knew it sounded crazy, but that was how these breakthrough technologies worked. He told me to remember when Bitcoin was nothing, and that the people who got in early made fortunes. I let the silence hang between us as if I were genuinely considering it. In truth, I was marveling at how completely he had revealed himself. No mention of paying me back. No acknowledgement of the 20 years of silence. Just his hand out, palm up, waiting. I finally said that I would need to think about it. He said of course, but that time was really a factor here. He said the window would close after Christmas, so if I was going to do this, we would need to move fast. The urgency was manufactured, of course, create pressure, eliminate time for second thoughts. Classic con artist tactics. I told him that I understood and that was all I could ask. He thanked me for even considering it, saying that it meant everything to him. I hung up and sat back in my chair, watching the morning sunlight glint off my notepad. He had taken the bait completely. No suspicion, no questions about how I had recovered my losses so quickly. Just pure, undiluted greed. I picked up my pen and wrote a single word, confirmed. 20 years of silence, and now he wanted $300,000 based on a 5-minute phone call. The audacity was almost admirable in its brazenness. Almost. I glanced at my watch. The business day was just beginning, and I had other calls to make, other pieces to put in place. David thought he was playing me, but he had no idea the game had already begun. With that bait set, I turned to the contacts I had compiled during yesterday's research. The investors David had burned deserved to know where their money had gone and where the man who had taken it was hiding. I started with the venture capital firm first. The receptionist transferred me to a Mr. Davidson, who sounded tired, even at 9 in the morning. His voice sharpened as he asked what my connection to David Brooks was. I said that I was someone who believed in accountability and understood that David owed his firm a considerable amount of money. He told me that, considerable, was an understatement and that they were talking about deliberate fraud, but that he had vanished. He said there was no forwarding address, no contact information, and that their lawyers were frustrated. I asked him what if I told him I knew exactly where David was. I could hear his chair squeak as he leaned forward, and he said he was listening. I told him he was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and had been hiding there for months, living at his mother's house while planning his next scheme. I provided the address, phone number, and social media evidence I had gathered. Davidson's excitement was palpable. He asked how I knew all this. I told him to just say I had a personal interest in seeing justice done. After Davidson, I contacted the 3 private investors David had named on his failed company's registration documents. Their reactions were remarkably similar: initial skepticism, followed by barely contained rage when I provided proof of his whereabouts. A woman named Helen Martinez, who had lost $50,000 in his solar panel startup, called him a little weasel and said she knew he was hiding somewhere. She added that her lawyer had said they would need a private investigator to track him down. I told her to consider the investigation complete. I also said that I was sending her evidence of his current lifestyle, social media posts showing expensive purchases, restaurant visits, and luxury items, all while claiming bankruptcy. By noon, I had contacted 7 investors. By 2 o'clock, they were forming a collective lawsuit. By 3 o'clock, they had a conference call scheduled with their legal teams. I sat back in my home office, surrounded by papers and screenshots, listening to my phone ring with updates. Each call brought more satisfaction than the last. Davidson called back and said he didn't know who I was, but that I had given them exactly what they needed. He said they were filing emergency motions to freeze his accounts and seize any assets they could find. He asked how quickly I thought they could move. I said we were talking about days, not weeks, and that Christmas might be very interesting for David. I filed away Davidson's business card with the others, creating a neat stack of consequences. For 20 years, David had lived without facing accountability for his actions. That was about to change. The phone rang again. This time, it was Helen Martinez. She said that their lawyers were coordinating with the others and that they were going to hit him from all sides simultaneously. No more hiding. No more games. I told her I was glad I could help. She then said that when they found him, and they would find him, she wanted to thank me properly. She said that I had given them hope when they thought all was lost. I hung up and stared out at the Lincoln streets where my son thought he was safe, where he thought he could continue his schemes without consequence. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world crisp and clear. The visibility was perfect for what was coming next. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to the local news station. If David wanted to play games with other people's money, perhaps it was time Lincoln knew what kind of neighbor they had. With alliances forming, I drove out the following afternoon to gather the final piece of evidence I needed. St. Elizabeth's Hospital sat on the east side of Lincoln, its brick facade dusted with snow. I parked in the visitor lot with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing that familiar antiseptic smell that always reminded me of my own heart surgery years ago, the one David hadn't bothered to visit me for. I walked through the lobby, my footsteps echoing on polished floors, past families clutching flowers and worry. I found a woman named Janet Morrison in the medical records office, a woman I had known since my accounting days when I had handled the books for her late husband's dental practice. She looked up from her computer with surprise and asked what brought me there on a day like this. I greeted her and said I needed a favor, and I knew this was delicate territory. Her expression shifted to weariness as she asked what kind of favor. I pulled out a business card from Davidson's firm. I told her that I was helping with a fraud investigation and that there was a woman claiming cancer treatments she had never received. Collecting donations under false pretenses. Lives are being affected. Janet studied the card, then looked back at me. Stanley, you know I can't just. Melanie Brooks, I said, the name of my ex-wife tasting bitter. She's been running a scam on social media, claiming chemotherapy treatments that never happened. Good people are sending money they can't afford because they believe she's dying. Something shifted in Janet's eyes. She'd always been a woman who valued honesty above bureaucracy. This stays between us, she said quietly. 20 minutes later, I sat in my car reviewing the printouts. Melanie's medical history was clean, going back 5 years, routine checkups, dental cleanings, a minor sinus infection last spring. Not one oncology appointment, no chemotherapy, no cancer diagnosis of any kind. The fluorescent hospital lights cast stark shadows across the papers as I read every detail. Each page confirmed what I'd already known. Melanie's entire cancer story was fabricated. Every donation, every sympathy message, every prayer sent her way was based on an elaborate lie. I tucked the records into my coat pocket, feeling their weight against my chest like armor. The drive home through Lincoln's quiet streets gave me time to process what I'd uncovered. Snow fell steadily, coating the world in white, making everything look clean and new. For a moment, sitting at a red light, I wondered if I was crossing ethical lines. These were private medical records obtained through personal connections rather than proper channels. But then I thought of the families sending $20 bills they couldn't spare, believing they were helping a dying woman fight for her life. The light turned green and I drove on. Sometimes justice required getting your hands dirty. Back home, I placed the records in my folder next to the investor information and lawsuit confirmations. 3 separate angles of attack, all carefully orchestrated, all perfectly timed. David and Melanie had spent 20 years believing they were smarter than everyone around them. Tomorrow would test that theory. I glanced out my kitchen window, where Christmas lights twinkled in neighbors' homes, and allowed myself a smile. The holiday season was about to become very interesting for the Brooks family. The phone rang one more time that evening. I let it go to voicemail, already knowing it would be David or Melanie with another urgent request or manufactured crisis. But their time for making demands was running out. After tomorrow, they'd be too busy dealing with consequences to bother their poor, forgotten father. I poured myself a cup of coffee and settled in to review my plans one final time. Christmas morning was only hours away. Christmas dawned crisp and clear, and I gathered myself for what would be the most satisfying holiday in 20 years. I dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual, and drove across town to the address David had texted me weeks ago. The house sat in a newer development, all vinyl siding and identical landscaping, with Christmas lights strung unevenly across the porch. I could see shapes moving behind the windows, probably Melanie fussing over last-minute preparations while David counted imaginary profits from his fictional investment opportunity. Dad. David opened the door with arms spread wide, as if we'd been having weekly dinners for years instead of radio silence. You made it. Come in, come in. Melanie appeared behind him, thinner than I remembered, but with that same calculating look in her eyes. Stanley. Oh, it's so wonderful to see you. You look prosperous. I stepped into their warm living room, noting the expensive furniture that didn't quite match, the oversized television, the designer bags carelessly draped over chairs. All purchased with other people's money, no doubt. Thank you for having me, I said, hanging my coat on their rack. I brought something special for later. A surprise for both of you. Their eyes lit up immediately. A surprise? Melanie clasped her hands together. How thoughtful. We sat down to dinner at a table that could have fed 12, loaded with dishes that looked impressive but tasted like they'd come from the grocery store deli. David carved the turkey with theatrical flourish, while Melanie filled wine glasses and peppered me with questions about my recovery from the cryptocurrency losses. So fortunate that you managed to bounce back, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. These market fluctuations can be so unpredictable. Indeed they can, I agreed, cutting my turkey into precise pieces. But I've learned to be more careful about who I trust with financial advice. David launched into a detailed explanation of his AI investment opportunity, complete with projected returns and timeline urgency. I nodded along, asking questions that made me sound interested while watching their faces grow more animated with each perceived sign of my willingness to invest. The knock came just as Melanie was serving dessert, sharp, authoritative, the kind of knock that meant business. David frowned, setting down his fork. I wasn't expecting anyone. He walked to the front door, Melanie and I trailing behind. Through the window, I could see a man in a dark coat holding an envelope. Nicholas Brooks, the man asked when the door opened. Yes. You've been served, he handed over the envelope and turned to leave. David stared at the papers, his face draining of color as he read. This can't be right. What is it, honey? Melanie peered over his shoulder. It's a lawsuit. Multiple lawsuits. The investors, they found me. His hands shook as he flipped through pages of legal documents, emergency asset freezes, demands for restitution, criminal fraud allegations. How did they even know where I was? His voice cracked slightly. I maintained my concerned grandfather expression while internally savoring every moment of his panic. Oh no, Melanie said, reading over his shoulder. Stanley, this is terrible timing, right during Christmas dinner. These things have a way of catching up with people, I observed mildly. David was pacing now, running his hands through his hair. I need to call my lawyer. No, I need to get out of here. They could freeze everything. The house, the accounts, everything. How much do they want? Melanie asked. 2 million, plus damages, plus interest. He looked like he might be sick. Melanie turned to me with that familiar expression I remembered from our marriage, the one that appeared whenever she needed something expensive. Stanley, she said carefully, I know this is awkward, but David's family, our son, and with your recent good fortune, maybe you could help with the legal fees, just until this gets sorted out. She reached for her phone, probably to start calculating exactly how much she thought she could extract from me. I smiled at her, the same patient smile I'd worn for 20 years of manipulation and dismissal. Actually, Melanie, I think you're going to have bigger problems than legal fees very soon. She looked up from her phone, pausing mid-dial. What do you mean? I know someone who specializes in fraud cases, she said, her voice taking on that determined tone I remembered from our marriage. A Facebook friend, brilliant lawyer, handles these kinds of situations all the time. She opened her phone and navigated to Facebook, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. I watched her face, knowing what was coming, but curious to see how it would unfold. The first notification badge showed 97 messages. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she wasn't concerned yet. Popular people got lots of messages, especially during the holidays. Then she started scrolling. What the hell, she whispered, her face going pale as she read. The phone trembled in her hands. Melanie, what is it? David leaned over her shoulder, lawsuit papers forgotten. They're saying I faked having cancer. Look at these comments. Fraud. Scammer. Disgusting. There are hundreds of them. I sipped my coffee and watched the show unfold. She scrolled faster, her breathing becoming shallow. There's a news article. Lincoln woman exposed for fake cancer scam. How did they, who would? Nicholas grabbed the phone and read aloud, anonymous source provides medical records proving Melanie Brooks never received cancer treatment despite collecting thousands in donations for chemotherapy costs. This can't be happening, Melanie's voice cracked. Someone hacked my medical records. This is illegal. Is it true? David asked, his voice deadly quiet. Of course it's not true. I'm fighting cancer. You know I'm fighting cancer. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt creeping into David's eyes. He was many things, but he wasn't stupid. The medical records were too detailed, too official to be fabricated. Jesus, Mom. Jesus Christ. Do you know what this means? They're going to investigate everything. My lawsuits, your donations, all of it. Melanie's phone buzzed with another notification, then another. The messages were pouring in now. Former donors demanding refunds. Reporters requesting interviews. Authorities asking questions. Make it stop, she whispered, staring at the screen. Make it stop. I can't make it stop, David snapped. You did this. You brought this on us. I didn't do anything. Someone set me up. They turned to me simultaneously, as if suddenly remembering I was there. Their faces showed a mixture of desperation and hope, the same expression I'd seen countless times when they'd needed something from me. Stanley, Melanie said, her voice becoming honeyed despite the panic. You said you had a surprise for us. Please tell me you brought what we discussed. The money for David's investment. We need it now more than ever. David nodded eagerly. Dad, I know this looks bad, but we can fix this. With your help, we can hire the best lawyers, the best public relations firms. We can make this all go away. I stood up slowly, setting my coffee cup down with deliberate care. Their eyes followed my every movement, hungry and desperate. Actually, I have delivered your surprise already. The words hung in the air like smoke. I walked to the coat rack and pulled on my jacket, taking my time with each button. What do you mean? Melanie's voice was sharp with rising panic. I mean exactly what I said. I've already given you what you deserve. But the money, David started. There is no money. Not for you. I walked to the door, their confused voices following me. Stanley, wait. You can't just leave. We need to talk about this. But I was already turning the handle, stepping out into the cold Nebraska night. The door closed behind me with a soft click, cutting off their pleas and protests. I walked to my car without looking back, though I could see the warm glow of their living room window in my peripheral vision. Inside, they were probably still trying to process what had just happened, still believing they could manipulate their way out of consequences. The engine started smoothly, and I pulled away from the curb. In my rearview mirror, I saw a figure appear at the window. David, probably watching me disappear into the darkness. 20 years of silence, 20 years of dismissal, 20 years of treating me like I didn't exist. Now, they knew exactly how that felt. Days blurred into weeks, and reports trickled in through Lincoln's tight-knit network of gossip and genuine concern. The story had legs, as they say in the news business, and it ran far and wide. Janet from the hospital called first. Stanley, I hope I did the right thing. The authorities contacted me about those records. Turns out someone had anonymously tipped them off about the fraud. I'm sure you handled it appropriately, I said, stirring sugar into my morning coffee. The local news picked it up, then the state papers. Something about it just caught people's attention. Maybe the audacity of faking cancer for money. Other updates came through chance encounters at the grocery store, casual conversations with neighbors, fragments of information that painted a picture of systematic collapse. David's court battles had been swift and brutal. The investors, armed with evidence and fueled by righteous anger, had presented an airtight case. The judge had shown no mercy for someone who'd stolen retirement funds and college savings to finance a lifestyle of lies. Lost everything, reported Tom Harrison, whose law firm had handled some of the paperwork. House, car, bank accounts had to move back in with his mother, if you can believe that. But Melanie's situation was arguably worse. The cancer fraud had struck a nerve with the public in ways David's investor schemes never could. People could understand bad business deals, but faking a terminal illness crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Her Facebook page had become a wasteland of angry comments and demands for refunds. The local news had run a follow-up story about how her fake treatments had coincided with promoted miracle cures and unproven supplements, suggesting she'd been profiting from desperate people's hope in multiple ways. Fraud charges are likely, mentioned Carol from the library, where I'd started volunteering on Tuesday mornings. The district attorney's office is taking it seriously. But the most satisfying update came from an unexpected source. The mail carrier, a young woman named Sarah, who'd been following the story, stopped by my house with a package and couldn't help sharing what she'd seen. "I delivered a bunch of registered letters to that address yesterday," she said, referring to David's house, legal documents by the look of them. The woman who answered the door, his mother, I think, she looked like she'd aged 10 years. I thanked her and went inside, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, complete peace. The spring that followed was a revelation. I discovered that freedom from resentment was like recovering from a long illness. Suddenly, the world had color again. I took my first real vacation in years, driving through the Rocky Mountains, staying in small towns where nobody knew my story. In Colorado, I met a retired teacher named Margaret, who told me about her volunteer work with literacy programs. By the time I returned to Lincoln, I'd signed up to help adults learn to read. It felt good to build something instead of just tearing down. The community center where I volunteered was full of people who'd faced real challenges, job loss, family problems, health issues, and had chosen to move forward instead of backward. Their resilience put my own struggles in perspective. "You seem different," observed Father Martinez from St. Mary's, where I'd started attending again, lighter somehow. He was right. The weight I'd carried for 20 years had lifted, leaving room for things I'd forgotten I enjoyed: books, long walks, conversations with people who valued honesty over profit. I still lived in the same modest house, still drove the same reliable Honda, but now these things felt like choices rather than limitations. I had enough money to live anywhere, do anything. But I discovered that satisfaction came from different sources than I'd expected. One evening in May, as I was planning a trip to visit the Grand Canyon, my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number, but I let it go to voicemail. Later, I listened to his message, a rambling apology mixed with subtle requests for financial help. I deleted it without a second thought. The next morning, I packed my suitcase and loaded my car with maps and travel guides. The Grand Canyon could wait, though. First, I was going to drive through Kansas, where I'd heard about a small town that needed help rebuilding after a tornado. It felt good to have somewhere to go, someone to help. It felt good to be needed for the right reasons. As I pulled out of my driveway, I glanced once at the house where I'd spent so many years waiting for a phone call that never came. Now I understood that I'd been waiting for the wrong thing entirely. The road ahead was empty and full of possibilities. I pressed the accelerator and drove toward whatever came next, leaving the past where it belonged, in the rearview mirror, growing smaller with each mile. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.